The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Welcome to Garden Connections. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham. On today's program, we learn about wicking beds, winter squash, and water features. Joe Deden from the Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center demonstrates how to create a wicking bed, which is a clever way of storing water for when your plants need it most. Dave Sloan talks about the components of a pond and shares a great example from the Central Gardens of North Iowa. And as usual, Chef Stephen Larson gives us a delicious recipe made with winter squash. Stay with us. Garden Connections is next. Joe Deden is the founder and executive director of the Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center near Lanesboro. He joins us to extol the virtues of a wicking bed, especially when it comes to water conservation. Let's find out why. One of the things we really enjoy here at Garden Connections is when we hear from you. And today we are going to learn about a project that was an inquiry from one of our viewers. They wrote in and said, I really want to learn more about wicking beds. So that's what we're up to. And we have invited Joe Deden, who is the executive director of the Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center, to teach us how. Welcome to the program.
Stephanie, it's great to be here.
Great. You guys do so many things. We're going to get to wicking beds here in just a moment, but tell us a little bit about the mission of Eagle Bluff.
So Eagle Bluff is a residential environmental learning center. So we have 155 schools, about 12,000 students a year that come in and spend time with us to learn about the ecology of the region. And one of the things we're interested in is healthier students, addressing childhood obesity and what people eat, which therefore leads into what they grow. So that's how we got into wicking beds, was looking at different ways for people to grow food.
All right. Give us a sense. Now, you made a great big one. We're going to do a smaller demonstration here today, but tell us why you were interested in this particular method. What's the general concept behind a wicking bed?
Wicking bed gardens are an Israeli-Australian water conservation raised bed. Okay. So we wanted to show people how they can do it in an urban setting and use water conservation methods. And then because we work with students, they're not very good at watering every morning or every afternoon. Right. So a wicking bed you can water on Monday, water on Friday, you can get through the weekend, you can get through the week.
Great. Well, let's talk the basic concept. And we're going to start with a container. Now, when you guys did your wicking bed, you did it outside. It's quite large. It's 8 by 16. Yep. And how did you form the structure? Tell us a little bit about how you decided how big you wanted it to be and what materials you used to kind of create the perimeter.
So my garden at Eagle Bluff is an old volleyball court.
Okay.
That we've converted to a garden, and I ended up setting up 8 by 16 quadrants with pathways around them as units that I want to garden, and then we rotate those blocks around and what's growing in them. So basically, you want to have something that you can comfortably reach to the middle on.
Okay.
Luckily, I have longer arms.
Long arms. And you use lumber to construct the perimeter. We've got just a sample here. Now this is untreated, which is important, I know, at our place. Is that what you'd recommend? It tends to shorten the lifespan of it, but there
is the balance. So we ended up using treated.
You did, okay.
And we used treated because it has a pond liner. So there's no way that the chemicals from the treated material can get into the water, get into the soil one way or the other. And since we're building something that we want to have last for a long time, I didn't want to have to redo it. But if people have something around like an old cow tank, a watering tank, they can utilize that. So recycling
is good too. So if you got something at home that is a container that could be lined and hold water, they can use that. Okay, so we are, for the purposes of you folks at home being able to see the structure of these wicking beds, we're just going to use a plastic tub here, and your container has to actually you have to be able to drill through it, right? Because we're going to put some pipes in there. So you lined your bed.
Right, so you could have a bathtub, but as you pointed out, you need to be able to drill through it.
Right.
So the first thing is to put in some sort of pond liner, and it can be plastic.
Now this happens, I picked up this is only 1 mil, so this is just a thin little one. Is this thick enough? Is this gonna do the job?
So depending on how big your area is and if you have trouble with rodents or moles or other things that could be getting into it, so it is adequate. But we ended up going with a pond liner, which I think is 10 mils, so 10 times
That's
thicker.
pretty thick, yep.
A more of a rubber emulsified sort of unit. And therefore that gives us a little bit more time period longevity for use.
So especially if you're recycling, your container doesn't have to be watertight.
Correct.
Because you're going to put this liner in
Correct.
instead. Okay. So for purposes of demonstration here, our plastic tub doesn't have any holes in it, but if your container does, you'd want to line it.
And then we have, since we set up a square foot garden, once we had the pond liner in, we ended up putting staples every foot. So that ended up holding the pond liner in place as we were adding more material to it. So,
Okay.
you know, clothespins and anything to temporarily hold things in place are
Right.
a great way to do that.
Right. Okay. So what are you going to put in the bottom?
Well, we're going to put rock in, but the first thing is that there's a standpipe that we end up putting water in.
Okay. So we're
And
gonna
then
do
there's a
it-
diagonal pipe that runs across the width of the bottom. So we would end up, let's have the other one too, we'll use this as a standpipe. So this is where we're putting water in, and this is distributing it across the whole wicking.
Okay. And
So
this
these-
is just PVC piping that you
Right.
can find in a home supply store.
Right, and probably with a cap on to prevent having problem with mosquitoes or whatever else getting down into it.
Okay, good
Right,
point.
so these two, there would be an elbow.
Right.
So it is
Okay.
connected together.
So you want one pipe in the bottom, and these pipes have holes in them. Is that
Perforated.
correct?
That's right. So that distributes the water over the whole bed.
Okay. So the basic theory is you're going to take your garden hose, you're going to run it down your standpipe, and it will filter out through the base of your garden
Right,
or your
and the
container,
water
whatever
will-
it is that you have.
Yep, rise up.
Okay.
Right. So we have another pipe function for this pipe, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay.
So once the pipe is in place, you're going to add gravel into the unit.
Yep. Well, let's see how big that is. Now, this is just pea gravel that I picked up again at a home supply store.
Right,
Is
so-
that the right size, or is
Correct.
that too small?
We ended up using washed pea rock.
Oh, you did. Okay.
So I think that would be the definition of it one way or the other. And so our bed is 8 by 16, so it took like 4 cubic yards of actually gravel. So I mean, it was like a small dump truck or be a heavy pickup load of gravel in order to be able to go into that.
And the reason you put gravel next to your
Over the
in
top.
pipe, so to speak.
Right, so then it just holds it in place, and then the water will wick up through the gravel.
Okay. Because if you put your dirt or your compost right on it, you would more than likely plug up your holes. Is that right?
Correct,
Okay.
correct.
All right. So rock goes in the bottom.
All right, so once we have this filled up with rock to whatever level, basically about half of it, then we're going to put actually these pipes, we would have more of the pipes, and they're going to go diagonally, sticking out one side. All right?
Okay,
And this is
so-
going to be your fill tube, so when the water gets to a certain level, because these have holes in it that perforate it, then the water starts running out the side. And you'll see that on one of ours where we have water coming out the side.
Okay.
And
So
then-
you put water in on purpose, but if for some reason, like because yours is outside, you get a heavy rain
Right.
and the water rises up, you don't want to drown out your plants, so you've got these pipes in place, probably, somewhere around here.
Halfway.
Yep,
Whatever
halfway.
your depth is.
So halfway from whatever your depth is, and these also have holes in them. The water can escape then and come out the side of whatever your container or your raised bed is.
Correct.
Okay, so we've got
So once
pipe,
the
rock,
liner's in,
pipe.
the rock's in, the pipe's in, then we're going to go with a root barrier,
A root barrier. Okay.
weed barrier, whatever you want to call it.
Now this is something that I use at home as a weed barrier on top.
Yep. So
for
same
my
thing.
plants.
So it's going to keep the roots from going down into the gravel.
So you can see it's not watertight. If you can see my hand through there, but so air does move through there
And water.
and water, but it discourages plant growth
That's correct.
through there. All right.
So that's in place, and then on top of that, we're going to end up adding our composted soils. And if you're doing a square foot garden, Mill has Mel's Mix, which is 2 parts composted soil, 1 part vermiculite, and 1 part peat moss.
You want something very porous with a lot of organic matter that you soak it up.
Correct.
All right.
All right.
Sounds good.
And then on top of that, so once we had everything in, we kind of packed it all down. And then, like I said, we did a square foot garden, so we ended up stapling our pond liner in place every foot around. It was string our twine between the staples to come up with our square foot garden. And then we started putting the plants in. Once we had the plants in place, we watered them initially from the top. So they, get their root structure down into the soil and started growing. And after that, it was just all wicking up. So if you remember last summer, we had a very wet spring and we had a very dry summer.
Right.
So the advantage of a wicking bed is that when you water a garden, normally 60 to 80% of the water that goes on the surface is evapotranspirated directly up. So
So it doesn't sink down.
You're losing 60 to 80% of it before the plant can even have access to it. So the advantage of a wicking bed is that the water is wicking up, so you'll have it contained in a reserve below.
Right. It can't evaporate before it is of some good use to your plants.
Just think of last summer's drought, and as we get into unstable climate sort of situations and more of the country being in drought, then wicking bed gardens can become much more important, and that's why the Australians and the Israelis were the ones who developed them.
Sure. And how did it go the first year that you put it in?
Really good. So we have about 12 inches of growing material. So parsnips, carrots are fine. Onions are obviously on top. We have a trellis on both ends. So on a road bed, there were some willows growing nearby. So we went and borrowed a couple willows from the road bed, the township road bed, and then arched them to form a trellis. So we had pole beans growing on one end and trellis tomatoes on the other.
Great. Well, you're doing wonderful things over at Eagle Bluff. Give us the website so people can check out the photographs of what they did with their wicking bed, as well as a wealth of other information.
Well, how about if I give you a couple websites?
Sure.
So Eagle Bluff is www.eagle-bluff.org, so eagle-bluff.org, and then River, www.riverrootsschool.org.
Okay. Great, thanks. Thank you so much for demonstrating this wicking bed concept to our viewers. We really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
All right. Stay with us. More Garden Connections is coming up next. The Central Gardens of North Iowa, one of my favorite gardens in the region, and we are going to learn about pond design today. And Dave Sloan is here with us. He helped create this beautiful structure at the gardens. Dave, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Stephanie, for having me.
All right. So this is quite an amazing piece for this garden, and most homeowners are not going to install something like this in their home. But let's talk about the basics of pond design. And in general, what does a pond add to a home?
Well, there's some main things that pond adds. It adds sound, it adds texture, elevation change, adds color, you add plants, the rocks add more color. It just adds a lot of serenity to a garden.
So give us some background on structure. This clearly is a large piece and it extends way down the garden, but what are some of the basic components that people need to think about when they're creating a pond or thinking about working with someone to create a pond?
Yeah, the first thing you want to look at is what you have for elevation changes in your yard or where you're going to put your pond, and see if it's going to work in that area. You're going to have an area that can be higher and an area that can be lower. And then if you don't have the elevation change, there's other gardens, water gardens that you can do, like pondless waterfalls that you just have like an urn or something which is way smaller in design.
So if you're looking at something maybe a little bit bigger, you're going to dig a hole, create some drop, that kind of thing. You can't just dig a hole and run some water. What else do you need to add to the mix?
In a general pond, there's usually, what we do is we install a kit. And the kit comes with a liner, biofalls, a skimmer, a hose, the essentials to get it started, and then you connect everything together to complete a complete system.
Okay. How does the water get from the top to the bottom? Explain that cycle to us.
Okay, there's a system where you have a a biofalls and a skimmer.
What is a biofalls? What does that mean?
A biofalls is where the water comes and is returned from a pump, and then it is brought through to create the waterfall effect.
Okay, so that's the top.
That's the top. At the bottom is a skimmer, and the skimmer contains the pump. So when it's sucking through, it goes through an entrance and then a filter system, and then it goes into the pump so you don't clog up the pump.
Right.
So it's filtered first, and then it goes up to the biofalls through a hose.
Okay.
And then
Does the hose have to be buried
the
underground?
hose does need to be buried.
Okay.
Not real deep. We suggest like 2 to 3 feet
Okay.
to keep frost if you want to run your pond in the winter.
So we've got circulating water. Now on a beautiful sunny day like today, I would assume there's some natural evaporation. Do you need to be constantly adding water to your pond?
Yes, there is maintenance of adding water to the pond as it evaporates. You'll also lose a little bit to splashing and wind and so on and so forth, just depending on how your pond's set up. But you can do different things like have automatic water fills that you can add to it.
Okay.
So it's like a toilet valve.
Oh, sure, just with a float on it.
Yeah, it has a float or a cattle tank valve where it just automatically fills itself. You can add those easily.
So when we look at structure, one of the really great things is, like you said, the noise, the peaceful sound of water flowing. And you've got flat rocks, you've got round rocks. How do you decide what makes the best structure to get the right noise? Because
Okay.
I would assume different rocks impart different sounds.
Yes. With the waterfall, you usually want something somewhat flat, so then you get a nice smooth sheet or a fall that's kind of consistent. With a round rock on a falls, you're just going to have little tiny trickles everywhere.
Okay.
If you want a louder pond, you're going to want to have an actual drop of the water. So like here we have actual fall of the water to water. Okay, if you want more of a quieter pond, you'd have more of a stream or a run. And if you go down this pond, you can kind of see that there's different levels that drop off that will create a rapids effect more than a waterfall effect.
When we're talking about depth of a pond, you talked about that 3.5 feet deep for winter. Is there a recommended depth for having fish?
Yeah, you stick with that 3.5 feet.
Okay, so about the same.
Yeah, and like I keep my fish over winter outside, so in my pond, and my pond's 4 feet deep, so they did fine.
They did just fine. All right. Is it important to have fish in a pond, you know, in terms of maintenance? Do they do any, you know, I think of when you have a fish tank for your kids, do you always get a little sucker guy to clean off the tank?
Yeah.
Are fish an important component, or can you do without them?
It is pretty important to have fish. If you want to keep a clean pond, you want to keep a natural ecosystem going. So they actually do a good job of keeping the algae under control and just keeping the whole thing in an ecosystem.
In balance, okay. Well, part of this balance are the beautiful plants that you put in around the pond. So we're going to go check out some of those, and you can explain to us which ones work best in this type of feature. So
Sounds
let's go check them out. Well, we're here now in a different section of the pond, and we're going to talk about plants.
Yeah.
So lots of really fun ones that you can put in the water, but give us some of the basics that we see right here in front of us.
Okay, we have a lily pad here, and they come in different colors.
I love that burgundy color. That's really nice contrast.
Yep, and they'll also flower here pretty soon.
Okay.
So you'll get a lot of those little tulip-looking flowers here, and that really brightens up. You'll get whites and burgundies and pinks, and there's some blues that pop up later in the year.
All right, and you've got some lovely flowers that are blooming over there. Iris?
Yep,
Is
we
that
got
right?
some iris over there. And you get different colors of those also. There's some purples and yellows here. What you'll find is they're planted in different heights in the pond. Okay. So in the pond system, you want to create ledges for your plants at certain depths. Like the lilies should be like about 12 to 24 inches deep. And then your irises here will want to be higher, so their stems they don't have a long stem on them. So they can exist in a lower area, more on the edges of the ponds.
And you almost see some of these others that have been planted in the beds kind of creeping down towards the water, so they're attracted to it as well.
Yep, that adds a nice texture to the edge of the pond. You want to do like some sedums, just general native plants that would work along the edges to soften the rock, because if the rock was just there, it'd just be a solid
right? Not quite as interesting. So if you look into the water, it looks a little fuzzy down there. Is that a normal part of, I mean, what is that stuff?
That's an algae, and
Okay.
actually algae is good for a pond.
It is, all right.
A lot of people like to go in and clean it every year and make it look
Scrub the rugs,
pristine.
and-
You
yep.
know, that's actually bad for your pond because you want it to have that ecosystem of, you know, the fish eating the algae, and the algae actually helps control the string algae, which we have a little bit of string algae in here that probably could be cleaned up a little bit at some point, but it will overtake if you don't control it.
If you
So
don't.
you do need to use some pond chemicals also.
Okay. And what about runoff? You know, we often hear about runoff on lakes, and that's what causes kind of the green bloom. Are the things that are susceptible in lakes also applicable to ponds?
Yes, like if your leaves and stuff, and if your yard is leaching into your pond, if you get a lot of nitrogen in your pond, it's going to be harder to control.
Okay, so when you set up a pond, you really want to kind of look for an open space that's not next to a tree that sheds a lot.
Right, if you're going to have a great big oak tree above your pond, be prepared to do a lot of cleaning.
A lot of cleaning. Well, you've given us some great ideas for structure and for plants. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you, Stephanie.
being here. On Garden Connections, we'd love to see photos of your garden. Or if you have questions for our garden experts, contact us by emailing garden@ksmq.org or like us on Facebook. Winter squash have an excellent reputation for storing well. As you're cleaning out your cold storage bin, check out this recipe from Chef Stephen Larson. You'll be glad you hung on to those squash all winter long.
Hi, welcome to the kitchen. I like to clean out my root cellar this time of year when spring has sprung and we're thinking about getting ready for the next year's harvest or this year's harvest. One of the great things about winter squash is how well it keeps. Now we have a few different varieties of winter squash here. Acorn squash, which everybody knows about. One you may not be as familiar with is spaghetti squash. When you cook it and scrape out the insides, it kind of looks like strands of spaghetti. That's why they call it that. Butternut, which is probably very familiar as well, which we're using in today's recipe. And a variety that my wife and I like to grow on our farm, which we love, which is called Tetsu Kabuto. It's a green Japanese pumpkin. It's really wonderful. It's a great one. Seek it out if you want something interesting and different in the garden. Now, along with the winter squash, we're going to add some parsnips. So first thing we're going to do is peel and dice some parsnip here. Now we're going to take the top off, obviously, and a bit of this root, because that will actually get dried out in the ground. And we're going to peel that. Okay, and then this. Then we need 4 cups of diced winter squash. Now you can use the same type of peeler. I've got a fixed blade peeler, which chefs prefer, because it's very sturdy and very sharp without cutting your finger like you do with a paring knife maybe. And you can certainly use that. If you don't have that, you can use your trusty chef's knife to do the same thing. And then we'll cut that into slabs, which will then be the basis for our dice. So that'll give us more or less 4 cups. Get a 12-inch skillet going here. Get that nice and hot. Okay, so we're going to add these to the pan, then I'm going to cook them covered for a while. Now this is kind of an interesting, bit different way of doing squash and parsnips in this case, other than the usual standard sort of cut it in half and roast it in the oven, which is a fine thing to do and very good. But I think the flavors, the nuttiness especially, come out better in the pan like this. Also texturally, if you have people that don't really care for that sort of squash puree sort of texture, this is actually a little bit more like a cooked sweet potato. So it has a bit more bite to it and provides a little less mushy sort of flavor. Okay. 1/4 cup of walnut oil. Now I'm using a nut oil here. though you could certainly use any mildly flavored vegetable oil for that. And I'm also going to add just a teaspoon of kosher salt to get the seasoning going. So we let that cook. Then, to finish the dish, we are going to top it with some butter toasted hazelnuts and some crumbled fresh goat cheese. Right, so I think we're pretty much done here. Oh yes, that's beautiful. That's what we're looking for. Squash is cooked. It's got a little color on it. That's fantastic. I'm going to pick a nice serving bowl for this and get our squash in there. And while the pan is still hot, 2 tablespoons of butter. We'll let that get hot, which should happen very quickly. Then we're going to add our crushed hazelnuts to that. Okay, really just a quick sizzle is all we need. And then half a cup of crumbled fresh goat cheese. So there we have it. Winter squash, parsnips, toasted hazelnuts, and fresh goat cheese. Spring cleaning can be delicious.
Well, I've added a few things to my to-do list after today's show. I hope you found it inspiring as well. Thanks for joining us. See you next time on Garden Connections.